the exile law that erased your name from memory. In the 12th century, when the feudal order ruled France with stone and parchment, there was a punishment worse than death, one that did not scar the flesh, but instead erased the soul's very echo from the world. It was called damnatio memoriae by the scholars, though the villagers had another name for it, the exile of shadows. It was the law that struck your name from every record, every ledger, every memory, until not even a whisper remained. If you were chosen for this sentence, your fate was not simply to disappear, but to become as if you had never existed at all. Imagine a world where memory itself is a crime, where to speak a name, to recall a face, is to risk your own soul. This was no mere superstition. In certain baronies of northern France, chroniclers recorded cases where the lord, in anger or fear, would invoke the exile law upon those deemed traitors, heretics, or even rivals too powerful to kill. The punishment began with a ceremony in the village square, beneath the cold gaze of stone saints. A crier would read aloud the decree, naming the condemned one last time before sealing that name in darkness forever. From that moment, the erasure began. All parish and tax records were scoured, lines of ink scraped off with knives or covered with heavy wax. Monks tore pages from registers and burned them beneath the altar. Any property or possessions were seized and redistributed. Relatives and friends were forbidden, on pain of shared damnation, to mourn, pray for, or even mention the exiled. Gravestones were shattered, letters were burned, and should a neighbor speak the forbidden name, even in grief or protest, they too risked joining the vanished in the shadow of oblivion. It was a sentence designed to outlive the flesh. For the condemned, it meant wandering the earth as a ghost, unable to claim kin, unable to find shelter, unable even to answer to their own name if asked. In the harsh winter of 1143, an entire family was erased after a failed rebellion near Amiens. The chroniclers did not record their crime, only that no child of their line shall carry a name. In later years, villagers whispered that strange beggars wandered the forests nearby, faces hidden, never speaking, afraid even to look another in the eye for fear of recognition. The law was not written for justice, but for terror. The threat of obliteration kept the peasants compliant and the knights loyal. Local priests struggled with its cruelty. How could a soul, unremembered and unprayed for, find its way to heaven? Some, in secret, kept lists of the lost in coded script, praying by night for those whose names could not be spoken. But even the act of remembrance was dangerous. In 1178, a monk at Saint Riquier was hanged for keeping a roll of the forbidden dead, discovered hidden inside a psalter. His name, too, was struck from every record. What was it like to live under such a threat? Imagine the silence at the dinner table, the tension in every conversation. Children learned to ask about the gap in the family, and mothers wept for sons whose names they could not say. Love letters were destroyed. Songs that carried the name of the exiled faded from memory. Even portraits were defaced, eyes scratched out, features blurred by time and fear. The terror was so complete that, within a generation, even the story of the erasure itself was forgotten. Sometimes, though, memories do not go quietly. In villages haunted by the exile law, old folk claimed that the wind in the cathedral towers sometimes carried a name, barely heard, gone before it was understood. In dreams, the faces of the lost would appear, silent and accusing, leaving those who saw them trembling. On certain feast days, candles would gutter and go out, as if the spirits of the exiled were moving through the nave, searching for a voice to remember them. Modern historians still find traces of these vanished lives. A blank line in a marriage register, a gap in a family tree, a faded place on a church wall where a coat of arms was chiseled away. In the archives of Normandy, a fragment of parchment bears a single phrase, hoc nomen silere oportet. This name must be silent. The exile law was eventually abandoned, condemned by later kings and priests as inhumane and blasphemous. But its echoes survive, hidden in the language of power, in the way societies choose who will be remembered, and who will vanish. Every era has its own form of erasure, the burned letter, the censored book, the portrait painted over, the voice that falls silent at the table. And still the terror remains, that a life might be lived, loved, and lost, only for the world to pretend it never happened. So the next time you walk an ancient street or run your hand over a weathered stone, remember, Every blank space is the shadow of a name once spoken, a life once lived. And behind every silence, there is a story struggling to be heard, because the greatest cruelty is not to kill, but to erase. And some shadows, no matter how hard we try, cannot be kept from returning at the edge of memory just before the dawn. The law of civil death that made you legally a corpse. Imagine waking up tomorrow to find that, by the reckoning of the law, you no longer exist. You have not died in body. Your heart beats, your mind aches, your feet still know the way home. But to the world, to your country, to your own family, you are as absent as the dead. Your name is erased from records, your property gone, your marriage dissolved, your very presence considered a ghostly nuisance. This was not a story from myth or the plot of a Gothic novel. In medieval and early modern England, it was a legal reality, the living death of civil death. The law called it caput lupinum, wolf's head. To be declared civilly dead was to be stripped of every right and dignity, to be reduced not even to a beggar, but to something less than a person. It was a fate that haunted traitors, rebels, and the unlucky souls who crossed the crown or the courts at the wrong moment in history. For these men and women, there would be no gravestone, no marker, only the silence of paperwork, the absence of legal memory, a walking corpse in the eyes of the realm. It could begin with something as simple as a whisper, an accusation that you had conspired against the king, or plotted with his enemies, or simply offended the wrong noble. The machinery of law would rumble to life. Inquiries, warrants, the dread summons to stand before judge and jury. If found guilty of treason or certain grave offenses, you would be sentenced to civil death. In some cases, the axe or noose came first, but often your body was spared. Your life, however, was not. To understand this peculiar form of death, you must grasp how English law saw the world. The realm was a tapestry of oaths and bonds, between lord and vassal, husband and wife, freeholder and land. Existence was not just a matter of breath or heartbeat. It was a status, a network of rights and relationships sanctioned by king and church. To be dead in law was to be severed from all of this. It was not mercy. It was obliteration. The effects were devastating. Your lands, sometimes held for generations, were confiscated at once. The crown claimed them to be doled out as reward or bribe. Any debts owed to you vanished. Your contracts were void. If you had a wife or children, they became legal strangers. Your marriage instantly dissolved, your heirs denied. You could not testify in court, could not own a horse, could not even lodge a complaint if beaten in the street. In the market, your former friends would avert their eyes. In church, your prayers counted for nothing. For all official purposes, you were a shade, seen but not acknowledged. Family suffering was built into the punishment. A wife might be left destitute, her children barred from inheritance, the family name dragged through scandal and silence. Sometimes, a woman would remarry, the law insisting that her first husband was dead, even as he haunted the margins of the parish. Letters and wills reveal their anguish, a wife writing to officials, pleading for crumbs, a son forced to sign away his birthright, a daughter forbidden to speak her father's name. Yet, you walked the earth. That was the strangest part. The walking, the seeing, the knowing. There were accounts of men wandering from village to village, unable to settle or find work, shunned by all but the most desperate. Some fled to London, where the anonymous poor could vanish in the alleys and shadows, or to the wilds, becoming literal outlaws, hunted as animals. Others lingered near the edges of their former lives, watching as strangers harvested their fields, as new men took up their name, as old friends learned to forget them. There were some who fought back, not with violence, but with cunning. In rare cases, a living corpse would try to undo their civil death. They would petition the crown, beg for mercy, or seek loopholes in the law. A handful succeeded, their cases preserved in yellowing legal records, a pardon granted, a name restored, a wife reclaimed. But most remained unheeded, their pleas drowned out by the machinery that had erased them. Civil death was not unique to England. Variations of it haunted the laws of Europe. The mort civile in France, the Tod und begraben, dead and buried, in Germany. But in England, it was sharpened by the peculiar interplay of common law and monarchy. To be declared dead in law was to become a warning to others, a spectacle of what happens when order is defied, when the crown is threatened, when the machinery of society is disturbed. Strangely, civil death also left traces in culture. In ballads and tales, the living ghost appears as a figure of both horror and pity, a reminder that the power of the law extended not just to the body, but to the soul, to memory, to identity itself. For centuries, poets and playwrights would return to the theme. A man denied the comfort of death, condemned to watch his life go on without him, to haunt the world that no longer recognized his face. And yet, the law was not eternal. As the centuries turned and England modernized, the legal death sentence was gradually softened, then abolished. Reforms chipped away at the old statutes. Civil death became a memory, an artifact of a harsher age, but its echoes linger, in the ways we exile, in the ways we erase, in the fear of being forgotten by one's own world. Even now, the idea chills. Imagine it, losing everything not by blade or disease, but by words in a ledger, by the silent consensus of those around you. Imagine watching the world erase you, not for what you are, but for what the law decides you can no longer be. It is a death without burial, an absence that walks, a warning inscribed not on stone, but in the lives of those left behind. So, next time you pass a forgotten grave, or wonder at an empty name in a family tree, remember the law of civil death, a law that could make you a ghost in your own lifetime, wandering, watching, hoping for some act of mercy that might return you to the world of the living. For in Old England, to be civilly dead was the cruelest punishment of all, a life denied not by fate but by decree, leaving behind nothing but the echo of a name no one dared to say. The monastic silence, punishment that lasted for life. In the shadowed cloisters of medieval Europe, where the sunlit hours of prayer measured out the passing of life, a deeper darkness sometimes fell, one not of the night, but of silence. The monasteries of the Middle Ages, havens for scholars, scribes, and those seeking refuge from a brutal world, were also places of unsparing discipline. Amidst the chanting of psalms and the gentle clatter of pen on parchment, there existed a punishment so severe, so absolute, that many who suffered it claimed they would have preferred the certainty of death. It was the lifelong sentence of silence, exile not from the world, but from all human contact, while still living within the very heart of the abbey. To understand the terror of this punishment, you must first know the weight of a vow. Monks took sacred oaths, poverty, chastity, obedience, and, most binding of all, stability within their community. They lived by strict rules such as the rule of Saint Benedict or the customs of the Cistercians, which governed every moment from the hour of rising to the posture of sleep. Speech was tightly regulated, permitted only at certain hours, often only for prayer or confession. Silence was considered a spiritual discipline, a way to listen for God's voice in the hush beneath words. But sometimes, a brother would break the code. It might be a whisper of gossip, a forbidden word spoken in anger, a blasphemy muttered during a dark night of the soul, or it might be a graver offense, a secret letter to a woman, the theft of bread, an attempt to flee the cloister walls. The worst offenders risked excommunication or even death at the hands of secular law. Yet, for those whose crimes could not be pardoned, but whose blood could not be shed on holy ground, there was another fate, the silence. The punishment began at chapter, a public assembly in the cold, stone-lined hall where every brother gathered to confess his faults and receive correction. The abbot would stand before the accused, and after a ritual of prayer and admonition, deliver the sentence. From this hour forward, brother, you shall speak no more among us. You shall remain as one dead to the world, though your body yet walks within these walls. The monk's name would be stricken from the rolls, his seat in the refectory, empty. His cell, bare, but still within the abbey's bounds. What followed was a living death. The condemned monk could not speak, could not write, could not communicate in any way. His fellow monks, bound by sacred oath, ignored his presence as if he had vanished. He might labor in the gardens or copy manuscripts in the scriptorium, but if he spoke, his voice was met with blank faces and silence. If he fell ill, only the infirmarian would attend him, and then only in wordless care. The brothers passed him in the cloisters without a glance. He prayed alone in chapel, took communion in utter quiet, and lived out his days in a world of shadows. It was, paradoxically, a punishment designed not only to break the body, but the spirit. Medieval theologians wrote that the worst pain was not the lash or the stocks, but isolation, the gnawing, endless sense of being unseen, unheard, unremembered. The abbey itself became a silent tomb. Some monks went mad, speaking only to the wind or scratching lines into their cell walls until their fingers bled. Some endured, turning their punishment into a strange kind of martyrdom, writing prayers with their eyes, seeking God's presence in the depths of human absence. Few records survive of the men sentenced to perpetual silence. Their names are absent from the monastery annals. Their faces are lost in the faded frescoes and the worn pews of forgotten chapels. But a handful of chronicles, written by sympathetic novices or secretive brothers, give us glimpses. One tells of a monk in Normandy who, after 30 years of silence, was found kneeling at dawn with a faint smile on his lips, the wax of a candle pooled in his cupped hands, a sign, some said, that he had finally found peace. Another, in the Abbey of Cluny, scratched a single word, miserere, on the underside of his desk, begging mercy with the only voice left to him. These stories haunted the younger monks. The silence became a warning, more chilling than fire or chains. It kept the order intact, even as it extracted a terrible price. Some abbots invoked it rarely, others too freely, but all knew its power, the threat of being present, yet utterly alone. It was a mirror held up to the monastic ideal, revealing the fragile boundary between spiritual devotion and human need. The practice faded over time. The Renaissance brought new light, new philosophies, and a softening of monastic discipline. Silence remained a tool for prayer, but the living tombs were abandoned, their doors thrown open to the world. Yet, in the echoing halls of Europe's ancient abbeys, if you listen close, you can still sense the weight of old silences, a reminder that the worst exile is not from the world, but from the warmth of another's voice, the acknowledgement of one's existence. For in the end, the harshest punishment is not to die, but to live unseen and unheard, forever alone in the company of men. The law that forced people to wear burial shrouds in public. Medieval Germany was a land of stone churches and black forests, of tolling bells and strict boundaries, between village and wild, faith and fear, life and death. Here, the church's reach stretched not just into the soul, but into the very fabric of daily existence. And perhaps nowhere was this more chillingly clear than in the ancient practice that blurred the line between the living and the damned, the law that forced the excommunicated to wear their own burial shrouds in public, as if they were already dead to God. Imagine it. The year is 1370, and the world is smaller, darker, more haunted by things unseen. In a small town nestled between the Rhine and dense stands of fir, a man is called before the bishop's court. His crime is not murder, nor theft, but some offense against the church, a refusal to pay tithe, perhaps, or the public doubting of a priest, or a forbidden marriage performed in secret. The sentence is swift, and it is devastating. Excommunication. It is not just a spiritual wound, but a social execution. The church proclaims that, in the eyes of God and man, he is dead already. But the sentence is not invisible. To make it clear to all who see him, he is stripped of his colors, his belt, the signs of his living identity. In their place he is given a winding sheet, a length of coarse, undyed linen, the very shroud used to wrap the bodies of the dead before burial. This is not symbolic alone. It is physical and humiliating. The excommunicate must wear the linen day and night, wherever he goes, even as he tills his fields or begs bread from his former friends. His face and hands, pale and bare, are a walking reminder. I am already dead. I am a corpse in the world of the living. For most in medieval Germany, death was an intimate and constant presence. Plague and famine, war and childbirth, all lurked at the edge of every life. But there was still a line, a sacred passage marked by ritual and prayer that set the living apart from the dead. To wear a shroud was to be robbed of that line, to become a kind of ghost. Children shrank from the sight. Neighbors crossed themselves and hurried by. The shrouded ones were forbidden from markets, denied entry to the church, cast out from feasts, weddings, even from the protection of law. If beaten or robbed, they had no recourse. Their word, like their body, was considered dust. Church records from the city of Mainz, dated to 1382, describe a baker's wife named Margareta who was excommunicated after sheltering her runaway son, himself declared dead to God for refusing the priest's orders. She was forced to wear the shroud as she swept her own doorstep. People threw ashes at her feet, wrote a witness, and mothers told their children not to answer her greeting lest they catch her curse. Even merchants in the street would turn away, fearing that to touch the linen was to invite the same fate upon themselves. This public shaming was more than punishment. It was social annihilation. In a time when salvation depended on the church, to be excommunicated was to be erased from the world's memory while your heart still beat. The shroud was a sign not just to others, but to the condemned themselves. Every step, every glance, every act of labor or hunger was colored by the knowledge that, in the most important sense, your life was over. You might walk, speak, and breathe, but your name was scratched from the roll of souls. You were untouchable. The law demanded that the living remember you only as a warning, an echo of judgment that moved through the streets, turning eyes and closing doors. Yet, history is full of small acts of resistance. Some, desperate to shed the shroud, would travel barefoot to distant churches or pilgrimage sites, begging for forgiveness, sometimes crawling the length of the nave in penance. Others sought protection in borderlands where the church's grip was weaker, living in the shadows, forming makeshift brotherhoods of the outcast. In rare cases, a sympathetic priest or abbot might secretly allow a shrouded woman to pray in the churchyard at night, or an old friend might press a crust of bread into a pale hand when no one watched. But the linen never left their bodies, not until the bishop himself lifted the ban, or death finally made the costume real. Legal records from the Hanseatic cities reveal entire families, especially after disputes over property or forbidden marriages, forced into public mourning while still alive. One chronicle from Lübeck tells of a young craftsman shrouded and exiled after striking a priest in a drunken brawl. For months, he was seen only at the edge of the town square, a pale figure whom no one acknowledged, even as he starved and begged. He faded from life while still drawing breath, wrote a merchant, and no man could say when he had died, only that his soul was lost long before his flesh. There is a deep psychological terror in being made to wear your own burial clothes, to be forced into the role of a ghost while your mind still hungers for warmth, touch, forgiveness. Some, it was said, went mad, muttering prayers that only the dead should speak. Others disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again, their shrouds fluttering like the wings of lost spirits. The memory of these punishments lingered in local folklore for generations. Ghostly figures glimpsed at crossroads or drifting through the fog, faces hidden by the folds of linen, forever shut out from home and hope. As the centuries turned and the Reformation swept through the German lands, some of these harsh laws softened or vanished, but the mark remained. The shroud, once a symbol of final peace, became tinged with dread, a reminder of how close the living world stands to the threshold of oblivion, and how easily a community can turn one of its own into a walking memory. Today, a handful of burial shrouds from the period survive in church treasuries and museums. Strips of rough cloth, stained and fragile, their meaning almost lost. But if you listen to the stones in an old German village, you might still feel the chill of those days, when punishment meant not just isolation, but a living burial. To be shrouded was to be erased, not by the silence of the grave, but by the cold gaze of your neighbors. It was a sentence that turned the world itself into a tomb. Proof that sometimes the cruelest laws are those that make us mourn the living. If you ever find yourself walking the winding lanes of an old German town as evening falls and you see a pale figure in the half-light, remember the ones who were made dead to God and the world, shrouded in life, punished not by death, but by memory. The curse of the living dead man's bell in the shadowed corners of medieval Europe, where faith and fear danced hand in hand, few punishments chilled the soul like excommunication. To be severed from the church was to be cast into a living limbo, neither alive to your community nor truly dead to the world. But there was a ritual even more terrible, a rite so severe it blurred the boundaries between damnation and death. It began with a bell, a small, hollow sound that could erase a life as surely as the grave. The ritual was called Viva Mortuus, the living dead man's curse. Its origins are shrouded in the mists of the early Middle Ages, but the records that survive, faded and foxed with age, tell of a bell kept in the darkest recesses of cathedral sacristies. No ordinary chime. This bell was set aside for the worst of sinners, those who had defied the church's laws, betrayed sacred trusts, or blasphemed so grievously that penance was deemed impossible. Theft from the altar, violence in the nave, heresy whispered behind cloistered walls. These were the crimes that earned not just excommunication, but social death. When the sentence was passed, the condemned would be summoned to the cathedral at dusk. In some parishes, the ritual was performed before the altar. In others, the sinner was made to kneel outside, exposed to the cold and the eyes of the entire village. The priests would gather, each in full vestments, faces obscured by the gloom. The bell, a small, tarnished thing, bound in leather so as not to ring before its time, would be placed in the hands of the youngest acolyte. The rite began with prayer, but there was no plea for mercy. Instead, the priests intoned ancient psalms of judgment, invoking saints and martyrs as witnesses to the soul's banishment. Then, at the crucial moment, the acolyte would strike the bell 3 times behind the sinner's back. The sound was thin, metallic, strangely enduring, impossible to ignore. In that moment, the condemned was declared not dead, but dead to the world. From that day forth, no one, friend, family, spouse, or neighbor, was allowed to acknowledge their presence. Records from the 12th century Abbey of Saint-Hilaire describe the first such ceremony in chilling detail. The condemned, a stonemason accused of sacrilege, was led from the nave as the bell tolled. The villagers, who once broke bread with him, turned their faces away. Children were warned to leave the room if he entered. Market stalls would fall silent if he approached. Even the parish dogs seemed to sense the curse, slinking away from his shadow. The living Deadman was forbidden to speak at public gatherings, denied the sacraments, and excluded from the labor of the fields. No one could accept his gifts, answer his greetings, or mention his name in prayer. In effect, he became a ghost, a body moving through familiar streets, but seen only by the wind and the crows. Those who broke the silence and spoke to him risked being cursed themselves, or worse, joining him in the liminal darkness between life and death. The psychological toll was catastrophic. Survivors wrote of loneliness so profound it bordered on madness. Some went mute, losing the habit of speech. Others wandered the roads at night, eyes wild, knocking on doors that would never open. In rare cases, the condemned would try to flee, seeking mercy in distant towns, hoping the bell's curse would not follow. But word spread quickly, and in every village the ritual was recognized. The sound of the bell seemed to cling to them, echoing long after the ceremony had ended. Not all, however, accepted their fate in silence. There are accounts of those who tried to atone, leaving secret offerings at the church door, carving prayers into the bark of ancient trees, or tending the graves of those who had once loved them. In one account from 1347, a woman excommunicated for defying a corrupt priest continued to bring water to the sick under cover of darkness. Her presence was never acknowledged, but on the day she died, the village bell rang at noon, a sign, some said, that the curse had been lifted by God himself. Even the priests who presided over the living dead man's bell carried a heavy burden. It was said that to hear the bell's note was to invite misfortune. Some monasteries kept the bell locked away, wrapped in black cloth, its sound forbidden except in the direst need. Legends grew around the bell itself, that it could not be melted down, that it rang in storms, that if buried, it would find its way back to the altar before dawn. Children dared each other to touch the bell's rope, believing it would chill their hands with the cold of the grave. The curse lingered for centuries, an unbroken line of silence running through the history of church and village alike. Only with the slow rise of reason and reform did the living dead man's bell fall out of use. By the time the Enlightenment reached even the most isolated parishes, the practice was condemned as cruel and unchristian, a relic of darker days. The bells were melted, hidden, or thrown into deep rivers where their voices would trouble the living no more. Yet the memory endures. In some villages, old stones still bear faint carvings, a bell, a figure turned away, a single line scratched into the wall. He walks, but he does not live. In old churchyards, stories are still told of the ghostly presence who moves unseen, forever waiting for someone to break the silence. The curse of the living dead man's bell is a reminder that the greatest cruelty is not violence or exile, but the erasure of presence, the unmaking of a soul through the denial of even the simplest human connection. So, if you ever wander through an ancient village at dusk and hear the faint echo of a bell where no bell should ring, remember, it is not only the dead who haunt the world. Sometimes it is the living, made invisible by silence, who linger just beyond the edge of light, waiting to be seen once more. The ritual that banned you from casting a shadow. In the borderlands where old Europe frays into wilderness and superstition clings to every stone, there are stories so strange that even local elders struggle to recall them. Among these, hidden in the fragile pages of a centuries-old parish ledger, lies the record of a village whose name no map remembers. A place where the most dreaded punishment was not exile, nor death, but a ritual that severed a man from his own shadow. The legend speaks of a time in the late 1400s, when fear of witchcraft swept like wildfire across the forests and moors. In this isolated hamlet, huddled beneath a tangle of black pines, the townsfolk believed that evil moved not only in darkness, but in the shapes darkness left behind. Shadows, they thought, were not simply the absence of light, but proof of a soul, a double, a part of oneself left behind in the world. To lose your shadow was to lose your place among the living. So when accusations of dark workings arose, whispered behind hands, stoked by failed crops or sickly cattle, the village elders invoked a law as old as memory itself, the right of shadow severance. The process began with the naming. In a solemn midnight assembly, the accused was brought to the edge of the communal well, his name recited 3 times, each time fainter, until the last syllable vanished into the wind. The local priest would refuse to record it. Neighbors were forbidden to utter it. From that moment, the condemned man was both nameless and half-existent. Then came the ritual itself, performed at dawn, when the sun's first weak rays slanted through the fog. The villagers, hooded, silent, led the accused to the square, where a circle was drawn in ash and salt. Standing within it, he was forced to face east, as a bundle of sacred herbs smoldered at his feet. A black cloth, soaked in ink and lamb's blood, was held over his head. As the sun crept higher, the eldest crone would chant an old curse, hands weaving patterns that twisted the air. And slowly in the first true light, the man's shadow would appear to peel away from his feet, wobbling, flickering as if resisting, before thinning and dissolving into the earth. Witnesses swore that from that moment, the cursed one cast no shadow, no matter how bright the day. Sunlight seemed to bend around him as if repulsed. Even at noon, when every other villager's form lay long on the dust, his outline remained curiously flat, empty. Dogs would bark and cower. Children ran from his path. Most chilling of all, if his path crossed another's, the untouched ground where his shadow should have fallen was avoided for weeks, considered poisoned. A liminal zone where the laws of life and death blurred. The consequences were not merely social. The shadowless man became a true outcast, unable to work, trade, or worship with the rest. Crops wilted if he passed too near a field. Milk soured in homes where his feet had crossed the threshold. Some said food left in his presence would rot overnight. Others whispered that, come nightfall, the shape he lost during the day would walk the village alone, seen out of the corner of the eye, or flickering in the corners of candlelit rooms. If the cursed man survived, his days became a living death. Old letters found hidden in church walls describe one such soul wandering the woods, pleading for forgiveness, his voice echoing after dark. Villagers reported seeing 2 footprints on the frost, side by side, one real, one faint as breath, leading away from the village toward the forest edge, never to return. Historians struggled to explain the phenomenon. Was it a trick of light? A psychological curse so complete that even the condemned believed himself unmoored from reality? Or something older, darker, a ritual memory of ancient magic, passed down through generations, who believed that to erase a shadow was to erase a soul? What is certain is the impact. For generations after, villagers drew their curtains at dawn and dusk, refusing to look at the empty square where the ritual was performed. Children who misbehaved were warned that the shadowless man would come for them, drawn to those who took light for granted. Even today, rare folk traditions linger in forgotten corners of Europe. In some villages, new houses are never built where no shadow falls. In others, families still mark boundaries with lines of salt, fearful of places where the sun seems to hesitate. And in churchyards, gravestones for those accused of dark magic are placed facing north, so that, even in the longest summer, they cast no shadow toward the village. But But what does it mean truly to be cut from your own darkness? To be neither part of the world nor wholly gone from it? In the shadow's absence, do we lose our past, our future, or simply the proof that we ever belonged at all? Perhaps this is the greatest cruelty of all, not to be remembered as wicked or lost, but to walk in sunlight forever unaccompanied, untethered from the mark that binds us to the living earth. So, if you ever wander through a village square at sunrise and notice a place where the shadows refuse to gather, where the dust lies cold and the air feels heavy, step lightly. Remember those who once walked unshadowed, neither wholly damned nor saved, but exiled from even the memory of themselves. Because to lose your shadow is not just to lose your place in the world, but to lose the only evidence you ever truly existed. The Law of Shadow-Banishment in Bohemia. In the tangled heart of old Bohemia, where the forests grew thick and the fog clung to the earth like a second skin, there once existed a law so strange and chilling that its name alone was enough to silence a room. It was called the Law of Shadow-Banishment, a punishment not written in the annals of kings and popes, but whispered in the margins of chronicles, confessed in the dark corners of monasteries, and dreaded in every village from Prague to the forest's edge. The world knew how heresy was usually met. The heretic's fate was fire, or the cell, or the long, winding march to exile. But in a handful of Bohemian cities, as the medieval world twisted with wars of faith and shifting loyalties, a different sentence was devised, one that did not end in public execution, but in a slower, crueler erasure. Those accused of heresy, whether they doubted the priest's word, spoke kindly of forbidden texts, or simply worshipped in the wrong tongue, were called before the council at dawn. There, with the rising sun gleaming cold through the high windows, they were sentenced not to prison or stake, but to a life denied the very touch of daylight. They were forbidden to be seen in sunlight. They became, in the eyes of the law and their neighbors, creatures of the shadow. The sentence was as precise as it was pitiless. The condemned would be led from the council chamber at sunrise, a hood drawn low over their face. Their home, if they still had one, was marked with a blackened sign, and their name was read aloud at dusk, so all would know to shun them. From that moment, they were never to be glimpsed in daylight again. They could walk the streets only after sunset, shuffling through alleys and along the city's edge, cloaked in darkness. To be seen in sunlight, even by accident, meant instant death by mob or official blade. The logic behind the law was twisted yet clear. Sunlight, the elders declared, was a blessing granted by God to the faithful. Those who turned from the true path had forfeited that right. They were neither wholly exiled nor executed. They were erased from the rhythms of the living. They became the night walkers, specters forced into the world's margins. The practical cruelty was profound. How does one live without daylight? The condemned were denied honest work. Shops would bar their doors, neighbors would bolt their windows, fields could not be tended under moonlight, and most trades were impossible in the shadows. Even those who tried to help, passing bread at midnight, leaving water on the doorstep, risked suspicion and punishment themselves. Hunger set in quickly. Loneliness followed. Former friends and even family were forbidden to greet a night walker, lest their own loyalty be doubted. Children were taught to avert their eyes if they glimpsed a shadow too tall, or heard footsteps on the cobbles after curfew. Priests preached that to aid a shadow-banished soul was to risk one's own place in heaven. The condemned, caught between worlds, learned to move in silence, speaking only to the wind. Many tried to flee, but the sentence followed them. The law was echoed in town after town, spread by rumor and fear. A shadow-banished heretic might make it to the forest, surviving on roots and river water for a time, but the cold and the wolves were no kinder than the law. Few who vanished into the wild ever returned. Some, desperate to see their families again, risked a fleeting glimpse of home at dawn, hiding in the doorways and watching their children hurry to market. Sometimes they were seen. The punishment was swift. A cry went up, torches were lit, and the night walker was hunted down, beaten or worse, their body left as a warning at the edge of the town. A few tried to fight the law with cunning or faith. One chronicle tells of a scholar who wrapped himself in pitch-black robes and thick veils, moving through the city at dusk, recording what he saw in a diary now lost to time. Another tale speaks of a mother who, unable to bear her sentence, begged the town priest for forgiveness at midnight on Christmas Eve. He relented and in secret let her kneel by the altar. But word spread, and both vanished soon after, their fates unrecorded. But most simply faded. The historian who described the law in a brittle letter noted that none survived long. Loneliness, hunger, and the constant fear of being seen were enough to wither the heart and break the mind. For all its cruelty, the Law of Shadow-Banishment did not need a scaffold or a bonfire. It turned the simple act of living, of being seen, of basking in the sun, into a forbidden miracle. With time, the world changed, the wars of faith ebbed, and Bohemia's rulers softened. The law was quietly forgotten, erased from statutes, left to rot in the damp corners of abandoned archives. But in folklore and memory, the story lingered. Old people would point to the long, cold shadows at dusk and tell children to come home, lest the sunless ones were about. Stories of towns where no one dared look out at noon, lest they see a face not meant for daylight, drifted through generations. Today, few remember the law, and fewer still believe it. But sometimes, as dust settles over ancient stones, and the shadows stretch long, one might pause and wonder what it means to lose not life, but belonging. To be banished not to death, but to the world's dark edges. The law of shadow banishment remains a strange lesson from the past, a warning of what happens when a society decides that some among them do not deserve the sun, and when the greatest punishment of all is simply to become invisible. The wedding law that undid marriages in reverse. In the labyrinthine alleys and candlelit chambers of 13th century Italy, marriage was not just a promise whispered beneath vaulted church ceilings. It was a contract, binding, weighty, and watched over by the ever-vigilant eyes of the law and the church. Love, ambition, and fortune all tangled beneath the surface of these unions, but so too did the specter of betrayal. For in those years, across city-states like Florence, Siena, and Verona, there existed a law so severe, so absolute, that the very memory of a marriage could be erased, not only from records, but from the lives of all who once called it home. It was called the Lex Matrimonii Reversi, the law of the reversed marriage. In its coldest reading, it was simple. If either partner, husband or wife, was proven to have betrayed their sacred marital vow, whether by infidelity, secret consorting with a rival house, or even a public declaration of disloyalty, the wronged party could invoke the law. What followed was not merely a divorce. It was something far more unsettling. The union itself was declared never to have existed. The wedding, the oaths, the feast, all vanished from the annals of the city and from the ledgers of the church. To neighbors and family, it was as if the couple had never stood side by side at the altar. Children born of the union became legally unrecognized, their inheritance rights erased, their status thrown into shadow. Imagine the fear that must have haunted every household. A simple accusation, sometimes true, sometimes a whisper, twisted by envy or vengeance, could unravel the fabric of an entire family in a single verdict. Merchants who had built fortunes together could lose their standing. Noble women who had brokered fragile peace between feuding families found themselves returned to their fathers' homes, stripped of dowry and dignity, with all trace of their marriage blotted out by the ink of the law. The children suffered most. Declared bastards, they might lose their family name, their place in guild or church, even the right to live beneath the same roof as their mother or father. Records from Florence tell of a weaver's daughter who married into a prosperous merchant house, only to be cast out after her husband accused her, without evidence, of secret meetings with a rival. The court pronounced their marriage undone, as if it had never been. She returned to her parents, but her son was taken by the city, raised as an orphan, forbidden even to speak her name in public. The church bells that had once rung for her wedding now tolled only in memory, her place in the town's story erased. Lawyers, those cunning architects of power, became masters of the Lex Matrimonii Reversi. Some wielded it as a weapon, freeing men to remarry for political gain, or women to escape unhappy bonds, though always at terrible cost. Accusations flew during times of crisis, especially among the noble houses, where a single act of betrayal could mean the loss of property, titles, or alliances carefully forged over generations. It was not only the guilty who suffered. Jealous rivals or spurned lovers sometimes manufactured evidence, bribed witnesses, or whispered poison in the right ear, setting the machinery of erasure into motion. The church, for its part, walked a delicate line. Marriage was a sacrament, and annulment, let alone reversal, was meant to be rare, a last resort for cases of fraud, heresy, or forbidden kinship. But in the heat of politics and pride, bishops sometimes bent to the will of the powerful, granting the undoing of unions for reasons more earthly than divine. Papal bulls exist that wrestle with the consequences of such erasures. What to do with children who became illegitimate overnight, or with lands that now had no rightful heir? The aftermath of a reversed marriage was like a haunting. Friends became strangers, families divided, and entire branches of the city's history twisted out of existence. Legal records were burned, wedding contracts voided, portraits destroyed. It is said that some mothers kept secret keepsakes, ribbons, rings, a swatch of wedding lace, hidden beneath floorboards as proof that, for a moment, love had been real, even if the world refused to remember it. By the close of the 13th century, the cruelty of the lex matrimonii reversi began to draw criticism from philosophers and reformers. They argued that the law punished the innocent as often as the guilty, and that the cost of perfect memory was sometimes too high for the living to bear. In time, cities amended their codes, annulment replaced erasure, and children were allowed to keep their names and inheritance, even if their parents' marriage was dissolved. But in the oldest quarters of Florence or the quiet back streets of Siena, you might still hear a grandmother warn her granddaughter to guard her vow carefully for fear of losing everything. Not just her home or her love, but her very place in the memory of the world. For in the Middle Ages, to be forgotten was sometimes a fate worse than death, and to have one's life undone in reverse was to become a ghost among the living, wandering through the ruins of a history that the law had chosen to unmake. The land that turned you invisible by custom. There are places in the forgotten corners of medieval Europe where law and custom cut deeper than any sword, and punishment was not measured in chains or blood, but in something colder, a forced invisibility that stripped you of everything that made you human. This is the story of the remote feudal estate where a lord, with a word, could make you vanish from society without laying a single hand on you. They called it being made a voided man, a living ghost, untouchable and unseen, walking through a world that had sworn not to notice you at all. The estate itself, records call it Steinberg, or sometimes the Grey March, was perched on the edge of the world, a scatter of stone cottages lost among ragged hills and iron-bound forests. Here, the Lord's word was more than law. It was the very air people breathed. The peasants bent their backs in the fields, their eyes always low, for to draw the attention of the great house was to risk more than simple censure. In this land, the ultimate punishment was not prison or exile, but a declaration of nothingness, a sentence that could make a man, woman, or even a child as empty as air. It was a power rarely spoken of, reserved for the gravest offenses, accusations of theft, blasphemy, or simply the Lord's displeasure. There were no trials, no records, just a gathering in the main square. The townsfolk assembled in dread. The Lord's steward would stand upon the old stone, read out a name, and declare, "Let all present know, this person is now voided. See them no more." A bell would toll, a thin, bitter sound, and from that moment, the victim's existence was erased. The rules were simple, brutal, and absolute. No one could greet the voided. No one could look them in the eye, speak their name, or answer their questions. No baker could sell them bread. No friend could share a fire. No priest could offer a blessing. Even to acknowledge their presence was to risk joining them in the shadow. Within minutes, the voided became a ghost among the living. Their children were pulled away. Their spouses, if they dared, might risk secret kindness at night, but by day, the fear was too great. Neighbors would turn their backs and close doors without a word. The market stalls became walls. The roads became deserts. Some tried to break the spell. There are stories in the estate's brittle chronicles of a voided boy who knelt for days outside the chapel, hoping a priest might defy the Lord's order. But the priest, trembling, walked past as if the child were smoke. The boy wandered into the woods and was never seen again. Others tried to live on in defiance, refusing to leave their homes or accept their fate. For a while, the voided might linger on the edges of fields, gathering wild roots or trapping hares by night. But the estate was not forgiving. Hunger wore them down. Their silence grew heavier. If they spoke, their words fell on empty air. If they wept, no one turned to listen. Eventually, most drifted away, into the forests, to distant towns where their names and faces were unknown, or simply into the wild, where their bones would tell no tales. For those left behind, the lesson was unmistakable. The power to void a person was the power to rewrite reality itself. The community, bound by fear, became the instrument of erasure. Children were taught to look through the voided as if nothing stood in their way. Friends who had laughed and danced together became strangers. Even lovers learned to let their hearts go numb, for love was not enough to risk losing everything. The ritual of invisibility, simple but merciless, kept the estate in order better than 100 armed guards. In a world already racked by famine, plague, and war, there was a peculiar horror in this fate. Death, at least, was a release. Exile was a journey, but to be made invisible was to become a living absence, to walk through the only world you knew as a silent wound. People whispered that the voided carried a curse, that their shadows grew thin, that animals would not look at them, and even the birds fell silent when they passed beneath the trees. Fear did what iron could not. It turned the flesh to mist. A few stories survive of those who managed to escape. One tells of a woman named Lisa, voided for speaking against a steward. She wandered the estate for 3 days, invisible to all, before a passing tinker, ignorant of local custom, took pity and shared a crust of bread. The two vanished together, and years later, rumors spread of a ghost wife living beyond the river, a woman who could not be seen by anyone who knew her true name. But most stories end quietly, in hunger or despair. To be voided was to lose even the hope of remembrance. When a voided man died, no one would bury him, no prayers would be said, and his possessions were swept away as if he had never been born. His name was stricken from the rolls, and in the estate's memory, he had never existed at all. As the centuries turned and the lords lost their power, the custom faded, becoming a memory told in hushed tones by old women at the fireside. Some said the land itself was haunted by the ghosts of the voided, that on certain misty mornings you could glimpse figures moving at the edge of the fields, always alone, always unseen. But for the people who once lived under the shadow of the void, the lesson lingered. The greatest punishment is not pain or death, but the loss of all connection, the unmaking of self through the silence of others. In the ruins of Steinberg, moss now covers the stones where judgments were passed. The bell that tolled for the voided is cracked and silent. But if you walk there at dusk, when the wind is low and the world feels thin, you might sense the presence of those who once walked unseen, proof that memory, no matter how hard we try to erase it, will always find a way to speak. So the next time you pass a stranger on a lonely road, remember, to be seen is to exist, to be recognized, greeted, welcomed. These are the threads that hold our world together. In a land where custom could turn you invisible, the simple act of being noticed was the greatest gift of all. The legal funeral of the living heretic. Across the shadowed centuries of medieval Europe, faith was not just a comfort, but a force of law, an architecture of belief as solid and unyielding as the monasteries that dotted the landscape. In this world, a single thought could be treason, a single doubt could become a death sentence. Yet among the punishments devised for those who strayed from doctrine, none is as chilling or as surreal as the legal funeral of the living heretic. The records begin in the libraries of the 14th century, scattered among letters, chronicles, and marginalia in battered monastic archives. The most famous account comes from the monastery of St. Marcellinus, nestled in a forgotten valley in what is now northern France. The condemned was Brother Mathieu, a monk of unremarkable means, but a restless mind. He had questioned the nature of the Trinity, whispered doubts about relics, and, most damning of all, written letters to a rival abbot on the subject of free will. His ideas, though mild by modern standards, were poison in an age when heresy threatened the very unity of Christendom. The process began with an accusation. Fellow monks, torn between duty and dread, reported Mathieu to the prior. An ecclesiastical court was hastily convened, its members masked in ritual anonymity, their verdict all but predetermined. Yet, unlike so many others who faced the stake or the gallows, Brother Mathieu was not to die in the ordinary sense. Instead, the church would perform a ritual of absolute erasure, a legal funeral, in which the living heretic would be buried from memory, if not from the world. At dawn on the appointed day, the monks gathered in the candlelit nave. A bier, draped in black cloth, was prepared at the altar. The entire community, from kitchen novices to the prior himself, filed into the pews in silence. At the appointed hour, Mathieu was led forward, still clothed in his habit, but with his cowl pulled low over his face. He was commanded to lie down upon the bier as if already dead. The funeral proceeded like any other. Psalms of lamentation, readings from Scripture, the tolling of the great bell. Incense curled upward, filling the air with the scent of endings. The monks recited the prayers for the dead, not for Mathieu's soul, but for the idea of him, for the memory the monastery would now extinguish. As the choir intoned the final Kyrie, the prior sprinkled holy water across the living body of the heretic, and a shroud was drawn up to his chin. The effect was both theatrical and horrifying. To watch a man mourned as if dead, while he yet breathed and heard every word, was to witness a death of a different order. Some accounts claim that the monks wept, others that they averted their eyes, fearing contamination from doubt. The legal documents survive. Let it be known that Brother Mathieu, having fallen into heresy, has departed this life in the eyes of the Church. Let no man speak to him, nor of him, lest the poison return. But the ritual did not end at the altar. Once the requiem concluded, Brother Mathieu was raised from the bier and led in procession, not to a grave, but to a silent wing of the monastery, specially prepared for the living dead. Here, a cell awaited. Windowless, thick-walled, a single candle flickering against the stone. The doorway was bricked up behind him as the final part of the rite. Tradition held that a single meal would be passed through a small opening each day. But no other contact was permitted. To the monastery and the world, Mathieu was gone. He was not to be spoken of, prayed for, or remembered. His name was struck from the rolls, his possessions given to the poor, his letters burned. This was more than imprisonment. It was annihilation by ritual. The legal funeral of the living heretic was a sentence meant to outlast mere death. For the monks who remained, it served as a warning. The boundary between belief and oblivion was as thin as a page and as absolute as a tomb. Yet traces of Mathieu linger in the margins of later chronicles. A novice who tended the monastery gardens wrote of hearing singing from behind the walls on certain nights, snatches of psalms, half-remembered and haunting. Decades after the funeral, rumors persisted that the silent wing was never truly empty, that shadows moved behind bricked-up doors, and that sometimes, in the quietest hour before dawn, a voice could be heard reciting prayers for forgiveness. Other monasteries adopted similar rituals. In Germany, records survive of a nun exiled to a living grave for translating forbidden texts. In Italy, a deacon was interred in a chapel wall after disputing the sale of indulgences. Each case followed the same chilling script: a funeral for the living, a ritualized death, and a slow fading into silence. The psychological torment inflicted by this punishment is difficult to imagine. To be alive, yet officially dead. To hear your own funeral sung by those you once called brothers. To linger in darkness, sustained only by the memory of sunlight and the hope of eventual forgiveness. The law was absolute. Any monk who spoke with the living heretic, even in pity, risked sharing his fate. The walls of the silent wing became not only a physical prison, but a boundary between the world of the living and a shadow realm of exile and loss. Over the centuries, the practice faded as church law reformed and new notions of justice took hold. But its memory survives, in stained glass windows depicting shrouded figures, in margins of legal manuscripts, in whispered stories told in cloistered halls. The legal funeral of the living heretic is a reminder of how easily a society's deepest fears can be made flesh, how ritual and law can combine to erase a person more completely than death itself. If you ever wander the ruins of an old monastery and find a walled-up door, pause for a moment and listen. Beneath the silence, you might sense the echo of prayers for a soul the world tried to bury alive, a voice that, despite all ritual and stone, refused to be forgotten. The law of the wandering soul, in the far north, where the forests brood and the winters last forever, medieval Scandinavia governed its shadows with laws as cold as the grave. Among the most dreaded was one rarely spoken aloud, a punishment worse than iron chains, designed not for death, but for unending exile, the law of the wandering soul. To be named a wandering soul was to be sentenced to a fate as old as fear itself. Not all criminals were cast into dungeons or put to the sword. For crimes deemed both unforgivable and unworthy of swift execution, blasphemy, sorcery, betrayal, or grave insult to the clan. The elders gathered in judgment. If the sentence was exile under this law, it was announced not with a public flogging, but with a quiet ritual, often at dusk, as the sun bled out behind the pines. The condemned was stripped of shoes, cloak, and all tokens of kinship. Their name was read aloud one last time, sometimes with a scrap of their blood or hair burned in the village fire, then struck from every record, not with pride or anger, but with grim necessity. Barefoot and shivering, the wandering soul was cast out beyond the boundary stones, into the land of wolves and frost, with a single, terrible instruction: never sleep in the same place twice, and never linger long enough for your spirit to take root. For to rest too long was to risk binding one's own misfortune to the earth, cursing the land, the livestock, and those who remained behind. But the punishment did not end with the outcast. A curse rode with them, like a cold, invisible fog, that threatened anyone who dared show mercy. If you gave shelter to a wandering soul, if you shared bread or fire, you too risked sharing in their fate. The curse was contagious, creeping through the cracks of hospitality. For villagers, this meant looking away when they saw ragged figures in the trees at dusk, closing their doors to midnight knocks, refusing to name the shadows that drifted through the snow. Even the bravest risked little more than a handful of rye, left where roots and branches met, never handed directly, never acknowledged. There are stories, hundreds of them, preserved in sagas and whispered from grandmother to child, of wandering souls who tried to return. Some would circle their home villages in hope, watching the windows flicker with candlelight, listening to lullabies sung to children who no longer remembered their names. But they could never cross the threshold. The curse was too strong. The elders too afraid. Those who broke the law, who dared to take in a wandering soul, invited ruin. Crops failed, cows stopped giving milk, infants fell ill. In the church records, there are notes of entire families vanishing from the ledgers, their farms reclaimed by wild rye and ice. The villagers whispered that the land itself remembered mercy and punished it. The life of a wandering soul was a waking nightmare. Shoes wore out within days, and frostbite crept in. Some wrapped their feet in rags or birch bark. Others wandered forests and swamps, sleeping in the crook of tree roots or beneath overturned boats. They moved always under the cover of dusk and dawn, never daring to let themselves sleep deeply. Dreamless nights stretched into years. Hunger gnawed, loneliness ached. Those few who survived the first winter were changed. Silent, watchful, wary of both men and gods. To be a wandering soul was to exist in the liminal space between the living and the dead. In the sagas, they are described as ghosts in all but flesh, unseen, unspoken, yet always present. It was said that sometimes, in the depth of winter, you could hear them singing old songs to themselves on the wind, or see their breath rising from riverbanks just before dawn. When storms lashed the land and thunder rattled the roof beams, the villagers would cross themselves and murmur prayers for the lost, though they dared not name them. But the wandering soul was more than a punishment. It was a warning. It reminded everyone that belonging could be lost with a single misstep, and that mercy, though noble, came at a steep and terrible price. The law drew hard boundaries between home and wilderness, kin and stranger, forgiveness and survival. Over centuries, the custom faded. Christianity softened the older laws, and exile became less common. Yet, the legend endured. Even today in rural Scandinavia, tales persist of barefoot figures glimpsed at the edge of the forest, of voices calling across the ice in the dead of night. Some say that on certain holy evenings, if you leave bread and salt on the doorstep, a wandering soul may pause, bless your house, and move on, releasing both you and themselves from the curse for a single night. But the fear remains. To be cast out is to lose not only your home, but your place in the world's memory. To wander is to become a living ghost, both contagious and forgotten. And to show compassion, to take a lost soul in from the cold, is to gamble everything you love for a chance at redemption that history itself warns against. So when the night grows long and the wind howls across the empty fields, remember the law of the wandering soul. Sometimes, the harshest exile is not the cold of the wild, but the coldness of the hearts left behind. The Crown's Ritual of Disinheritance by Flame. Imagine standing before the stone steps of a royal court, heart pounding in your chest. as a crowd of nobles, courtiers, and curious villagers gather in uneasy silence. The wind carries the cold scent of tallow and smoke, and in the center of the courtyard stands a table draped in crimson cloth. On it rests a human-shaped figure, life-sized, fashioned from wax, adorned in a pale mockery of your own clothing, and marked with your name. In Hungary's shadowy past, this was no ordinary effigy. It was the instrument of a ceremony as chilling as it was final, the crown's ritual of disinheritance by flame. This was a land where lineage meant everything, where inheritance was not just wealth, but the root system of family, future, and fate. To be cut off was a fate worse than exile or death, for it meant becoming a living ghost to your kin. But in Hungary, the process was not hidden behind dusty legal papers or whispered in midnight deals. It was public. It was a spectacle. And it was ruthless. The origins of the ritual stretched back through centuries of turbulence, war, and betrayal. Monarchs and magnates, threatened by rebellious kin or treacherous vassals, needed a weapon that was both legal and theatrical. The ceremony combined law, magic, and the stark terror of public shaming. It was theater for the soul, a warning to all who might dream of turning against their house, their liege, or the king. When the decision was made, whether by decree of the crown or through a consensus of family elders, the accused was summoned to appear. Sometimes they stood among the crowd. Sometimes, fearing violence or vengeance, they were locked in a cell, forced to listen as their fate unfolded in the square outside. The ritual began with the reading of charges: treason, betrayal, insubordination, or simply becoming an embarrassment to those in power. Every word was chosen to wound, every accusation, a nail in the coffin of belonging. Then came the wax figure. Crafted by skilled hands, it bore the name and likeness of the living, often down to rings or locks of hair woven into the chest. A priest or royal official would anoint it with oil, reciting ancient words that invoked the weight of heaven and earth, blood and stone. For the briefest moment, as all eyes watched, the effigy became a vessel, a body for the spirit of the accused, a stand-in for their place in the lineage. As the final prayers faded, the wax figure was lifted high. The crowd pressed forward. A torch was brought, flames licking at the dusk, and with the king or the family patriarch's signal, the fire touched wax. At first, the figure glistened and trembled, features blurring as if in pain. Then it began to melt, slumping in grotesque surrender, droplets hissing as they struck the cold earth. The smell of burning tallow twisted through the crowd. The figure's name was shouted, once, twice, sometimes a dozen times, until the words seemed to hang in the air, scorched and hollow. In that moment, the accused was considered dead to the bloodline. The flames had done what no sword could, unmade them, erasing their claim to land, title, memory, and love. Their place in the family tree was gone, as if plucked and burned. Legal records were amended, property passed to others. Children were taught to forget. For the living, there was no return. The one who had been disinherited might wander the kingdom, but no door would open, no face would smile in greeting. Even a letter from such a person became poison, a reminder of a forbidden past. Yet, the pain was not confined to the victim. For the witnesses, especially kin, the ceremony was both horror and lesson. It was said that even the most iron-hearted lords shuddered to watch a wax image of their own son, brother, or cousin twist in the fire, the features collapsing into nothing as the old bonds of flesh and loyalty dissolved. Some wept, others spat, cursing the traitor's name, but none could deny the ritual's power. It was a final judgment, carried out in the open, impossible to forget. There were those who believed the fire had more than symbolic weight. Folklore whispered that the soul of the disinherited was scarred, that some part of the self was truly severed in the blaze. Old women claimed that such people wandered the world forever unsatisfied, unable to find peace or forgiveness. In rare cases, the outcast sought redemption, begging at church doors, appealing to foreign kings, or pledging their sword to a distant cause. But most faded, living in the shadows, their names erased from every family prayer. The ritual's echoes lasted for generations. Even long after the ceremony faded from official use, its legend haunted the Hungarian nobility. Families kept fragments of melted wax in hidden boxes, reminders of the price of betrayal. Poets sang bitter ballads of the ones who were burned but still breathing. And every child learned, from cradle to adulthood, that blood was precious, but fragile, that the fire could come for anyone, and that to be truly alone was to be erased while still alive. Today, the old squares and castle yards are quiet, the scent of burning wax long since replaced by the dust of memory. But if you walk the ancient streets at dusk and feel a chill, remember, in Hungary, the line between belonging and oblivion was once measured by the flicker of a flame. To be disinherited was not simply to lose land or title, but to vanish from the story itself. A living exile, your memory burning as the wax melted in the shadows of your own home. The oath that forced everyone to forget you, hidden among the fog-draped valleys and ancient stone circles of medieval Wales, there existed a ritual as unsettling as any punishment ever devised by the human mind. A ritual not of blood or fire, but of memory itself. To be banished from a Welsh village was to vanish from more than hearth and home. It was to become a ghost among the living, erased not only from land and law, but from the very lips and hearts of all who had once known you. This was the oath that forced everyone to forget. No law survives in parchment or crown charter. Yet, in the old bardic verses and folk tales, the story endures. When a man was condemned, whether for betrayal, blasphemy, or an unforgivable act of violence, he faced a fate known as Angofrwyd, the making forgotten. It began at dusk, as the village gathered beneath the twisted yew at the center of the green. The elders stood in a solemn ring, holding torches that cast long, trembling shadows. The condemned would be brought forth, his wrists bound, his eyes sometimes blindfolded against the horror of his fate. Before the entire village, the priest or the oldest among them recited the ancient words, "Let it be so, that from this night no mouth shall speak the name of the one cast out. No tongue shall recall, no song shall be sung, no tale retold. If any break this oath, let their fate be his. For memory is life, and to remember is to become." It was a binding, communal spell, part law, part superstition, part survival. Some say it was older than Christianity, rooted in the druidic rites of the old tribes who believed that a name held the soul itself. Once the oath was sworn, the condemned man was led from the village, never to return. The boundary stones, marked with strange symbols, would be watched for weeks. The villagers then began the hardest part of all, forgetting. His name was scraped from church records. The stories in which he once appeared were retold with gaps, his deeds attributed to shadows or to one who is gone. If his family remained, they mourned in secret, for to speak of him was to risk sharing his curse. And if someone slipped, if a wife whispered her lost husband's name in grief, or a child called out for a vanished father, the curse was said to leap like fire from soul to soul. The one who spoke the forbidden name would begin to fade in memory, their own identity blurring. In the oldest tales, they say the villagers would awaken from dreams with a stranger in their place, unable to recall whether they had ever belonged, or who they had once been. In this way, the Angofrwyd maintained its power, fueled by the terror of losing not just a person, but oneself. Travelers from England or France who heard the story called it barbaric, yet the Welsh believed it protected the community's soul. A village was more than stone and earth. It was memory woven through generations, a shared song. To remove a thread without tearing the whole, you had to erase it completely, root and branch, so the fabric could heal without reminder of what had been lost. Some said the ritual was a mercy, sparing the village the pain of vengeance or blood feud. Others believed it was a curse in disguise, for the ghosts of the forgotten sometimes haunted the edges of the fields, their silence heavier than words. In rare cases, an entire family might vanish after the oath, their names forbidden, their house left to crumble. The ruins became places of uneasy quiet, shunned by children and travelers alike. Locals swore that, on certain nights, the wind through the yew trees carried voices. Never a name, only the echo of longing and loss. Those who lived longest said that the greatest fear was not exile or death, but the slow erasure from memory, the dread of being spoken of in whispers only as the one we do not name. Centuries later, when English law swept across Wales, the ritual faded into myth. The Angofrwyd became just another story to frighten children, or to explain why certain graves bore no inscription, why a handful of songs were never sung. But the fear of the unnameable lingers. In some valleys, even today, there are tales of places where people will not speak of a neighbor who vanished, where to ask too many questions is to invite uneasy glances and hurried silence. For memory, after all, is the truest form of belonging. To be forgotten is to lose the only immortality the living can grant. And to remember a name that has been erased is perhaps to risk becoming a stranger to oneself. Caught forever between worlds, a living echo of the oath that forced everyone to forget. The mirror punishment that erased your reflection. Imagine a world where your greatest punishment is not a wound or a chain, but the slow, suffocating loss of your own reflection. A world where, with a decree from a noble court, your image is erased, not by magic, but by law and custom. Medieval Germany, a land of cold stone castles and labyrinthine laws, saw many creative, often cruel forms of punishment. Among the most unsettling was the banishment from mirrors, a sentence that declared your reflection unfit for God, and turned the simple act of seeing yourself into a forbidden memory. The earliest records of the so-called mirror punishment come from the court books of Württemberg and Franconia in the late 1400s. The penalty was not reserved for common thieves or vagrants, but for those who had shamed themselves and their house in the eyes of the court. Forgers, oath-breakers, traitors, sometimes even women accused of poisoning or blasphemy. Unlike public flogging or the stocks, this was a sentence designed to operate in private, gnawing at the soul rather than the flesh. The ritual began with the trial. If found guilty, the condemned would be summoned to the hall at dawn, while the courtiers and servants looked on in tense, uncomfortable silence. The presiding judge or noble would read out the sentence, declaring the person's image unfit for the world and unworthy in the sight of God and men. Then, with great ceremony, every mirror in their house, no matter how small, no matter how treasured, would be taken away, smashed, or sealed away under lock and key. But the punishment did not stop at the household. Edicts were posted in the town square, and the entire community was instructed. No glass, no polished metal, no reflection shall show the face of the condemned. Let no man or woman provide them such, on pain of equal shame. Servants would scrub the shine from pewter spoons, cover water basins, hang rough cloths over the glass in alehouses and market stalls. It was said that even the wells in certain villages were covered after dusk, so the condemned would never catch the ghost of their own face in the moonlit water. For the condemned, the days became a strange, lonely prison. To live without a reflection is to lose a small anchor of self, a silent confirmation that you are real and present in the world. You rise in the morning unable to see your own eyes, to check your hair, to witness the lines of age or the flush of shame. You pass others in the street, catching their glances, always furtive, always a touch too long or too quick, but never seeing yourself through their eyes. Over time, the isolation grows sharper. You wonder, do I still look as I once did? Am I fading? Does my smile twist or my brow furrow? There is no way to know, and no one will tell you. The psychological toll was immense. Church records from the Diocese of Bamberg describe a woman named Gertrude, once a minor noble's wife, sentenced to mirror punishment after her husband accused her of heresy. In her letters, smuggled to a sympathetic cousin, she described the feeling as walking in a world of ghosts. She wrote, "I reach for my face as if it might drift away. I cannot remember my own eyes. Even my shadow seems to retreat from me." After 6 months, Gertrude's cousin reported her withdrawn and silent, a shell emptied of hope. Others fared no better. An apprentice found guilty of counterfeiting coin in Nuremberg, forced to live without mirrors for a year, was said to have torn up his bedclothes and covered the very windows, claiming that even sunlight might expose the emptiness where his image once dwelled. Another, a knight caught conspiring against his liege, was forbidden mirrors not just in his home, but anywhere he traveled. He lived as an exile in his own country, haunted by the fear that he no longer existed for others, or for himself. Contemporaries saw the punishment as both practical and mystical. Some priests defended it, arguing that denying a reflection was a visible sign of spiritual disgrace. If your soul was corrupted, why should the world reflect your body? Others whispered that the practice bordered on witchcraft. For what is a person without a shadow, without an image? Superstition grew. People began to say that those deprived of mirrors might attract evil spirits, or that their faces would change in subtle, dreadful ways, unchecked by their own gaze. But beneath the rules and rituals, the punishment's power lay in its social cruelty. To be denied the reflection is to lose not only your sense of self, but your ability to belong. Human beings build identity in part through the gaze, our own and that of others. When that loop is broken, isolation takes root. The condemned became not just outcasts, but strangers to themselves. Some broke under the strain, confessing to crimes they had not committed, desperate to regain their reflection through public penance. A few tried to trick the system, sneaking glimpses in puddles or in polished blades, but the risk was high. Spies and servants were everywhere, eager to prove their loyalty by exposing such forbidden acts. After weeks or months, most could no longer bear it. Chroniclers describe former merchants, noblemen, even priests reduced to begging forgiveness at church doors, crawling on hands and knees, offering alms or public humiliation in exchange for their image. If the court or church was satisfied, a ritual lifting of the ban would take place. The condemned would be led to a mirror where, before witnesses, they would behold their reflection once more. It was said that many wept at the sight, as if seeing themselves for the first time after years in the dark. By the 17th century, as legal codes evolved and Enlightenment thought took hold, the mirror punishment faded into legend, but its traces lingered in folklore. Old tales warned children that to break a promise was to risk losing your reflection, that to see a face where none should be was a sign of guilt made visible. In dusty archives and the basements of ancient castles, shards of old mirrors still turn up, wrapped in cloth or hidden in secret drawers, a silent reminder of a time when the cruelest exile was not from home or land, but from one's own self. So the next time you look in the mirror and find comfort in your reflection, remember those who were denied that simple certainty. In the old courts of Germany, justice could take not just your freedom, but your face, and leave you wandering, unseen, until you no longer recognized yourself at all. The excommunication that withdrew your baptism. Across the darkest centuries of Christendom, there was a punishment so absolute it seemed to reach back through time and tear a soul from the arms of God. This was not simple excommunication, nor mere shunning by the faithful. It was a ritual known by many names, the unmaking, the second death, the black excommunication, but it was always the same in practice and terror. You were declared unbaptized, as if the sacrament that first welcomed you into the church, into society, into the very fabric of existence, had never been performed at all. To understand the weight of this sentence, you must understand baptism's role in the medieval world. It was not simply a rite of passage or a mark of faith. It was the metaphysical threshold between darkness and light, chaos and belonging. Baptism erased the stain of original sin. It inscribed your name in the book of life. It was, quite literally, your legal and spiritual birth, your first breath as a child of both church and community. Without it, you were nothing. Not a citizen, not a soul, just a shadow walking among the living. To be stripped of baptism was to become a ghost, untethered from heaven, shunned by the earth, denied even the hope of burial in sacred ground. The threat of this punishment was whispered in sermons and church courts, but its execution was rare, reserved for the gravest offenses. The murder of a priest, the burning of a church, or the open renunciation of every sacrament and law. When the church declared that a person's baptism was withdrawn, it was not just an act of justice, but a declaration of metaphysical war. The ritual itself was terrifying in its precision. The condemned would be summoned before the assembled congregation, usually at the front of the cathedral, where they had once been carried as an infant to the baptismal font. The bishop would wear full regalia, holding the book of the Gospels in one hand, and, in the other, a bowl of water now deemed powerless. Witnesses, friends, family, and neighbors were required to attend, forced to watch as the fabric of the condemned's life was publicly unraveled. The ceremony reversed the baptismal rite in every possible way. Where once the priest anointed the child with oil and water, now the bishop declared, "By your actions you have severed the covenant. As the waters once washed away your sin, so now are you cast back into darkness." He would dip his fingers in the water, not to bless, but to mark the condemned with a sign of erasure, a gesture that mocked the cross. The baptismal candle, once a symbol of new life, was extinguished in front of all. In some regions, the bishop would pour out the water upon the floor, as if to show that grace itself had been spilled and could never be gathered again. From that moment, the condemned was dead to the church and to the world. they could not receive communion, confession, or last rites. They could not be married or buried with Christian ceremony. Any children they had were considered illegitimate, their property forfeited. The community was forbidden to speak to them, eat with them, or shelter them. Priests were forbidden even to pray for their souls. It was as if the condemned had never existed, except for the warning their fate provided to others. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. Diaries and letters from the Middle Ages describe the condemned wandering the outskirts of villages, seeking shelter in abandoned barns, begging for scraps no one dared offer. Children were told to look away if the unbaptized passed by. In some places, even animals were believed to sense the curse, growling or fleeing from the condemned. Superstition grew. It was said the unbaptized could not cross running water, that their reflection would not appear in a mirror, that the very ground recoiled from their shadow. One account, from a 14th century chronicle in Aragon, describes a woman named Inez, who was stripped of her baptism for leading a heretical sect. After her excommunication, her husband was forced to abandon her. Her children were forbidden to speak her name. When she died of starvation outside the town walls, no one dared touch her body. She was left unburied until a storm washed her bones into the river. In the years that followed, villagers reported seeing her ghost near the old bridge, always alone, always silent, unable even in death to find rest. But the punishment did not always end at the edge of the grave. Without baptism, there was no hope of heaven, no place among the ancestors, no light at the end of death. Some theologians taught that the souls of the unbaptized were condemned to wander forever in the outer darkness, denied even the solace of purgatory. The community's memory of them was erased. Their names were struck from the parish rolls, their deeds unmentioned in sermons or stories. The living learned to speak of them only as a warning, a hole where a person should have been. Yet, in rare cases, mercy found a way. There are stories of villagers secretly aiding the unbaptized, leaving food at the crossroads, lighting candles on forgotten graves. In some distant valleys, a forbidden prayer would be whispered at midnight. Lord, remember even those who walk without your mark. The Church, over centuries, slowly tempered its harshest rites. The reversal of baptism faded, as new ideas of repentance and redemption took hold. But the memory endures, in the cracked baptismal fonts of ruined churches, in the cautionary tales still told to children, in the uneasy silence that lingers around those few ancient graves with no name. If you ever visit an old cathedral and feel a sudden chill near the font, remember, some shadows in history belong not to the dead, but to those who were unmade while still alive, cast out not by the hand of fate, but by the fear and power of those who believed they could erase even the first breath of a soul. The Ghosthood Law of the Leper Colonies. In the margins of medieval society, beyond the walls of towns and the farthest edge of the king's justice, there existed another kind of exile, a living death known as the Ghosthood Law. For those afflicted with leprosy, mere survival meant inhabiting a world where you were never truly alive, nor entirely dead, a soul condemned to walk in daylight, yet invisible to the eyes of the living. It began with a diagnosis, a lesion on the skin, a numbness in the fingers, a priest's whispered verdict. But the true sentence was not the disease itself. It was the bell. From the 12th century onward, leper colonies sprang up across Europe, sometimes in the wilderness, sometimes at the end of a long, muddy road. Their residents, called lepers or the walking dead, were required by law to carry a wooden clapper or a bell around their neck, and to ring it whenever they walked within earshot of the healthy. At first, it seems merciful, an early attempt at quarantine, a primitive shield against contagion. But the rules did not end with the bell. The Ghosthood Law demanded that a leper, upon approaching any road, bridge, or village, must cry out in a loud voice, "Unclean! Unclean!" The sound was a warning and a confession, echoing through fields, forests, and the foggy lanes of medieval towns. Yet the laws of the leper's world were more intricate and more cruel. For even as they were forced to declare their presence, strict decrees demanded that no healthy villager look directly at them. To meet the eyes of a leper was forbidden, as if sight itself could transmit the curse. To acknowledge a leper's face, to see their sorrow or their hunger, was said to risk your own soul and to defy the boundary that kept the clean and the unclean apart. And so, the lepers became ghosts among the living, heard but never seen, Their bells rang out across the meadows, down market streets, and into the hearts of children who learned to avert their gaze as soon as the sound approached. Doors were shut, windows darkened, markets paused. Even the priests and monks who tended the leper hospitals often did so with their eyes averted, offering bread and water through a slot in the wall, never touching hand to hand. In some regions, the law was enforced with chilling ritual. A person diagnosed with leprosy might be led to the edge of the parish cemetery, where a priest would sprinkle earth on their head and recite a funeral mass, not for their soul, but for their place in society. From that moment, the afflicted became legally dead. Their property was seized. Their marriages were dissolved. Their names, struck from the rolls of the living, drifted into silence. Some even received a grave marker while still alive, a warning that the disease had already claimed them in the eyes of the world. Yet, they continued to exist, hungry, desperate, and more alone than any exile. In the leper colonies, daily life was a careful choreography of sound and blindness. The bells never stopped ringing. The unclean voices echoed along the roads, a constant reminder of bodies left behind by law, by family, by God. The psychological weight of the ghosthood law was crushing. Some lepers, desperate for human contact, would stand outside church doors and ring their bells all through Mass, just to hear the hymns through stone walls. Others wandered the fields at dusk, hoping to see a face turn their way, to be recognized as a person and not a curse. But the fear of contagion was absolute. Stories spread that even a glance could bring illness, that the leper's gaze carried a shadow the living could never shake. Children grew up afraid of the bells. Superstitions multiplied, that the sound could bring bad luck, that shadows cast by a leper would blight crops, that the wind blowing from the colony would spoil milk. Even when the disease faded, the fear lingered. In some places, the law that forbade looking at a leper outlasted leprosy itself, transforming survivors into permanent outcasts, denied the simple dignity of being seen. But still, traces of resistance appeared, small acts of courage and humanity. A few priests risked a glance or a touch. Some villagers left food at the crossroads or in the hedges, too frightened to speak, but unwilling to let others starve. In the rarest stories, a child looked up when the bell rang and smiled, and the world, if only for a moment, remembered what it was to see and be seen. Today, the remains of leper colonies can be found in ruins outside old towns, crumbling chapels, overgrown graveyards, stone walls etched with claw marks and prayers. The bells are silent, but the silence itself is heavy with memory. It asks us to consider the price of survival when fear turns neighbors into ghosts and compassion into a crime. Because in the end, the ghosthood law was not just a rule, it was a weapon, designed to erase not just the body, but the soul. And perhaps its greatest cruelty was that it forced people to walk within reach of each other's voices, but forever out of sight. Proof that in the darkness of fear, it is possible to vanish long before death ever arrives. The naming ban that doomed a family line. In the tangled green wilds of 14th century Ireland, where every stone seemed to pulse with memory and every tree whispered the old tongue, there was a punishment as silent as it was final, a sentence not of fire or blade, but of memory erased, lineage unmade. It was the naming ban, a royal decree that could erase a family from the map of history with nothing more than a few words, spoken by a king in anger or fear. Ireland then was a patchwork of kingdoms and shifting loyalties, a land where bloodlines were sacred and names were everything. A surname was not merely a label, but a living record, a chain stretching back to myth, binding generations to one another, to land, to story. But to anger the wrong king, to rebel or refuse an oath, was to risk losing it all in a way no sword could undo. It began with defiance. A chieftain, perhaps proud, perhaps desperate, stood against the crown. Maybe it was a refusal to pay tribute, a raid across a forbidden border, or the simple assertion that no foreign king had the right to command a free Irish soul. Word would reach the English Pale or the High Court at Dublin. The clan had broken faith. And so, after the blood and thunder of reprisal, there would come a quieter, colder order, the naming ban. A royal herald would ride out, bearing the writ with the king's seal, accompanied by soldiers and the local bishop. The people would be summoned. Elders, children, mothers, all called to the center of their home village, under the gaze of the conqueror's flag. The name of the offending clan would be read aloud. O'Ruarc, McCarthy, O'Donnell, its syllables hanging in the air like a curse. And then the sentence, "From this day forth, none shall bear the name, not in speech, not in script, not at the cradle or on the grave. Any child christened with the forbidden surname would be forfeit, stripped of property, shunned by church and law, sometimes marked for death." The ban was absolute. It reached through generations, poisoning the root in every new leaf. For the clan, it was annihilation by silence. Children who once sang their family's name with pride were forced to choose new ones, commonplace, meaningless, or taken from the king's own roll. Fathers whispered lineage in the dark, passing on secrets like contraband, but dared not inscribe them on paper or stone. Mothers wept as they watched the markers in the old churchyard weather away, names disappearing under moss and rain, as if the earth itself was commanded to forget. But memory is stubborn, and the Irish spirit more so. Some families took to secret names, passing on the old syllables and code, hidden in stories, carved in places only kin could find. A handful fled into the wild, living as outlaws, clinging to a language of the shadows. In rare cases, a child, too bold or desperate, would try to reclaim the name, wearing it openly in defiance. Such acts were met with swift, brutal retribution. There are whispered tales of boys found dead on the riverbank, of girls vanished in the night, of entire households uprooted and erased for daring to honor the forbidden. Yet, for all its horror, the ban was not always absolute. In some corners of the island, sympathetic priests looked the other way at christenings, writing false names in the church registry and recording the truth in secret books. Neighbors forged kinship anew, inventing new surnames that echoed the sound of the old, a private resistance that kept memory alive when all else was lost. To be under the naming ban was to live on the knife's edge of existence. The world knew you only as a shadow, no land, no title, no story that could be told aloud. Children grew up unsure of who they were, hearing only fragments from their elders, learning to keep pride and grief locked tight in the heart. The clan's enemies would sneer at their erasure, but even they could not help but glance over their shoulders at dusk, fearing the anger of those who had been made nameless. Sometimes, a new king or conqueror would lift the ban, seeking to win local loyalty. Families would gather at midnight, digging out scraps of hidden parchment or old weapons bearing the forbidden crest, weeping as they spoke the name aloud for the first time in a generation. But for many, the damage was done. The chain had broken. The story had scattered to the winds. Centuries later, genealogists would stumble across strange gaps in parish records, lines of descent that vanished suddenly, graves marked only with initials, legends of lost clans that lingered in song but nowhere in law. The naming ban had done its work, and history itself had become complicit. To this day, echoes remain. In some Irish towns, old people still whisper of surnames you should never utter, of families who were erased by royal word, of children who vanished because they could not bear to forget. The green hills are filled with secrets, and every stone remembers the sound of names that were never meant to die. For in Ireland, to lose your name was not just to lose your past. It was to be denied a future, a place in the story, a root in the land. The naming ban was a punishment as devastating as any blade, a curse that made the living into ghosts and left only silence where a proud lineage once stood. The cloister rule that locked a woman in life burial. In the echoing halls and candlelit chapels of medieval Europe, where the destinies of noble women were often determined before their first breath, one rule stood out as a sentence more terrifying than death itself. It was a punishment whispered in shadowed cloisters, recorded in the annals of forgotten abbeys, and shrouded in the heavy silence of convent stone. For noble women who broke the sacred vows of obedience, chastity, or loyalty to their religious house, execution was rarely the church's answer. Instead, there awaited a fate designed to save the soul while burying the body, a life burial, alive but unseen, known as the viva clausura. The practice was cruel in its piety and absolute in its secrecy. Noble families, eager to forge alliances and keep daughters from entangling in political intrigue, often sent their youngest girls to convents at a young age. Many arrived unwilling, clutching memories of sunlight and laughter, their hands still soft from silk and song. Inside the walls, their world narrowed to prayers, penance, and the watchful eyes of the abbess. For some, the weight of expectation became too much, a whispered secret, a forbidden letter, A clandestine meeting? Any of these could doom a noblewoman to the most chilling penance the church devised. When a woman was condemned, the ritual unfolded with clinical precision. The sisters would gather for midnight prayers, the air thick with incense and dread. The accused, clad in plain linen, was led in silence to a small stone chamber, often no larger than a monk's grave, set deep in the cloister's foundations. The room was bare, save for a cot, a crucifix, and a slot in the wall, through which food and water were passed by hands she would never see. The door was sealed with prayers and iron bolts. Outside, the community resumed its rituals. Inside, time ceased to have meaning. From that moment on, she was both present and absent, a living soul interred within the abbey walls, her life a penance for vows broken. She was forbidden visitors, forbidden letters, forbidden even the comfort of a voice in the dark. Her only companions were the slow, muffled sounds of prayer and the eternal drip of water. She ate in silence, slept in silence, and spoke only to God, whose forgiveness was her only hope of escape. For most, the sentence was for life. Only in rare cases, an intervention by a powerful family, or a sign of miraculous contrition, would the abbess ever unlock the chamber. The cruelty was not in violence, but in denial. The noblewoman lived for years, sometimes decades, within her stone cell, watching the seasons change through the faint light that filtered in from a slit above. She listened to the abbey's bells tolling hours she could not see, felt her hair grow long and silver, and traced prayers onto the cold walls with trembling fingers. The world outside continued. Abbesses died, kings fell, dynasties rose and crumbled, but the woman remained, as forgotten as the relics buried beneath the altar. Records of the Viva Clausura are rare, but they exist, hidden in monastic chronicles and court petitions, in the desperate letters of mothers begging for mercy, or in the legend of a nun whose songs could be heard faintly beneath the chapel floor. In one case from France, a noblewoman was entombed for 20 years after a scandalous affair with a visiting knight. Her name was struck from family records her children sent away, her memory kept alive only by the offerings her mother left at the abbey gate each spring. When the cell was finally opened after the abbess's death, the woman's body was found surrounded by scraps of prayer, her face serene, as if she had found a peace denied to her in life. The sisters who enforced the rule did so with heavy hearts, but few questioned its necessity. In the eyes of the church, this punishment was a last chance for redemption, a soul saved through suffering, a community preserved from scandal. Yet, for the women who endured it, the chamber became a paradox, a grave without death, a monastery within a monastery, a silence so profound it could echo through centuries. The world changed, and the Viva Clausura faded into rumor. The Enlightenment brought new laws and gentler customs. The convent doors were thrown open, and noble women reclaimed their voices. Yet, in the ancient abbeys and ruined cloisters of Europe, you might still sense the weight of lives once lived in darkness, the memory of prayers whispered in hope and desperation. In the end, the life burial was a punishment for breaking faith, but it also stood as a testament to the strength of those who survived it. For even in the deepest silence, the heart remembers the world beyond the walls, and hope, like light, finds a way through the smallest of cracks. The rope that marked the living dead. In the labyrinth of medieval France, where stone walls echoed with secrets and the boundaries between justice and cruelty blurred with each shifting wind, there existed a punishment that turned every hour of life into a slow march toward the gallows. They called it la corde des morts vivants, the rope of the living dead. It was a sentence not merely of death, but of existence in the shadow of death, a daily reminder to both the condemned and the community that the fate of the gallows could be delayed but never denied. Picture a bustling village square in 15th century Burgundy, sunlight flickering on the faces of peasants, tradesmen, and nobles. The market is alive with barter and gossip, but all fall silent as a figure appears at the edge of the crowd. A man, head bowed, the coarse hemp rope looped tight around his neck, its ends knotted but not drawn. For all to see, he wears the emblem of his sentence, not a mark burned into flesh, but a noose that hovers always just above the skin, the pale ghost of execution's hand. The practice emerged in a time when public justice was both spectacle and deterrent. The rope was punishment for crimes deemed grave, murder, betrayal, heresy, acts that threatened the very order of the kingdom. Yet for reasons of mercy, influence, or political calculation, some condemned men were not executed immediately. Instead, they were spared, at least for a time, and set free to walk the earth with the rope as a constant symbol of their borrowed days. The rope became their identity, their companion, and their curse. For the condemned, life was a paradox. They were not prisoners, nor truly free. They could eat, sleep, labor, and even love. But wherever they went, the noose followed. The community was ordered to shun them. Bakers refused bread, cobblers denied shoes. Children ran from their shadow. Some wives would not recognize their husbands. Parents wept, but turned away. To greet the rope-bearer was to acknowledge death, to invite misfortune, or to risk the taint of guilt by association. Medieval chronicles recount men who tried to disguise their shame, covering the rope with scarves, tucking it beneath collars, but the law demanded it remain visible at all times. If caught concealing it, the punishment was immediate execution, for the rope was both a sentence and a warning to others. Town criers read the names of the condemned at market, their crimes recited so none could forget. The rope became a story in itself, whispered by candlelight, invoked to frighten children, or to explain why a neighbor's eyes seemed always downcast. Some rope-bearers wandered the countryside, becoming vagabonds and outcasts. Others remained in their village, determined to endure the public scorn, hoping for royal pardon or miraculous redemption. There are stories of men who lived with the rope for years, their hair whitening and their skin thinning while the rope frayed day by day, as if counting down the hours until its purpose would be fulfilled. In rare cases, a condemned man might be granted forgiveness by a bishop or king. If so, a ritual would be held in the church square, where the rope was cut and burned, its ashes scattered as a symbol of the man's return to life. But most bore the mark until the end. Some succumbed to despair and took their own lives, unable to withstand the slow strangulation of hope. Others met death in tavern brawls, or from hunger and cold, shunned and forgotten. The rope was both a punishment and a prophecy. Its presence a living execution, its absence the final silence. The community, too, was marked. The rope reminded all of the power and reach of the law, the fragility of mercy, and the darkness that could descend on anyone, given the wrong word or witness. Legal scholars of the era wrote of the rope as a living limbo, a way to keep punishment present in the community, to remind every soul that justice was both patient and inevitable. The condemned man walked through a world that would not embrace him, yet would not allow him peace in the grave. His every gesture, every meeting, every meal was colored by the knowledge that the rope around his neck was a ticking clock, counting not just his hours, but the village's capacity for forgiveness or vengeance. With the coming of the Enlightenment and new ideas of law and humanity, the rope was finally abolished. The gallows remained, but the living death was no longer tolerated. Yet, in the rural corners of France, old men remembered the time when a condemned man could walk among the living, the rope a silent shadow, and every step a negotiation with fate. Now, when you visit the ruined castles and cobblestone squares of France, you might sense the memory of those who wore the rope, their names lost, but their lesson lingering in the air. That sometimes the cruelest punishments are not swift or bloody, but the slow erosion of belonging, the daily burden of a sentence that makes every living breath a rehearsal for the final drop. And in the echo of that rope, you can still hear the plea for mercy, for memory, and for a place among the living. Even as death waits quietly, only a nod away. The stone tablet that replaced your headstone before you died. In the cold echo of medieval justice, the line between life and death was sometimes drawn with stone, not sword. For certain crimes, those considered so grave, so unforgivable, that society wished to erase not only your deeds but the very hope of your future, the sentence was not always immediate execution or exile. Instead, some courts devised a punishment that was both psychological and spiritual, the stone tablet that became your headstone before you died. This was more than a grim custom. It was a deliberate spectacle, practiced in pockets of Europe for centuries, with records scattered from the mountain towns of the Alps to the lonely villages of the North Sea. The earliest surviving mention comes from a 13th century court ledger in Swabia, where a nobleman sentenced for high treason was led from the courtroom not to the gallows, but to a stonemason's yard. There, under the stern gaze of judge and townsfolk alike, A rough slab of limestone was inscribed with his name, the date of his sentencing, and a single, chilling line: "Here lies one who has lost the world's forgiveness." The condemned was forced to watch. Sometimes, the mason would turn and ask for the spelling of the name, forcing the prisoner to speak it aloud, as if confessing their own erasure. The tools rang out: hammer, chisel, the slow scraping of stone, and the act became a ritual undoing of identity. Witnesses described the faces of the accused, drained of color as each letter was carved, the finality of it settling on their shoulders like earth on a grave. When the tablet was finished, it was set before the condemned. They were required to touch it, sometimes even to kneel and read the inscription aloud in front of the court, clergy, and assembled villagers. In some cases, the headstone would be paraded through the streets, shown to neighbors and kin as a living warning. There are accounts of children weeping, spouses fainting, old men turning away, unable to meet the eyes of the one whose fate had been sealed not by death, but by the world's anticipation of it. But the cruelest part was still to come. The condemned was not always executed. Instead, they were released, stripped of property, rights, and reputation, but alive. The headstone, now a silent accusation, was displayed in the churchyard, set in a reserved plot of earth awaiting their body. Some were forced to visit it regularly, to pray for forgiveness before the stone that bore their name. Others could only watch as weeds grew around the slab, as weather blurred the inscription, as new graves were dug and filled nearby, reminders that their time would come, but the world would never again welcome them as truly living. This punishment served many purposes. It was a deterrent, of course, a public demonstration of the court's power over life and legacy. But it was also a form of social erasure. Those who bore the mark of the living grave found doors closed, voices hushed, eyes averted. No one wished to invite the shadow of doom into their homes. Merchants would not sell to them. Priests would not offer absolution. Children learned to cross the street if they saw the marked ones approach. In the chronicles of the time, we find the stories of these living dead. A weaver in Flanders, sentenced for theft, spent 20 years passing his own gravestone each Sunday on the way to Mass, always alone. A baker in Burgundy, falsely accused of sacrilege, spent a lifetime tending the graves of others while his own stone waited, untouched by flower or prayer. One woman, condemned in Venice for poisoning her husband, was forced to scrub her tablet clean after every storm, her own name a curse she could never wash away. There were rare cases of redemption, if new evidence arose, if a bishop interceded, if a ruler granted pardon. In such moments, the tablet was broken in a public ceremony, the fragments cast into a river or buried at a crossroads. But for most, the stone endured, outlasting flesh and memory. It became a legend. Villagers would warn children not to linger near the reserved plots, lest the restless spirit of the living condemned whisper secrets from beneath the soil. Psychologically, the punishment was devastating. To see your own grave prepared, to live each day knowing the world had already buried your hopes, was to suffer a slow unmaking. Letters from the period speak of nightmares, of insomnia, of an ache that no prayer could soothe. Some lost the will to speak. Others tried to outlive their fate by leaving their homeland, but the memory of the stone followed them. A sentence not only carved in rock, but etched in the minds of all who knew. As Europe changed and laws evolved, the practice faded, surviving only in folklore and scattered tombs. But its shadow lingers in the old churchyards, where nameless stones sit apart, half swallowed by earth, their inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of rain. Sometimes, a visitor will find one of these and feel an unexplainable chill, a sense of absence where a life should have been. If you ever wander through such a graveyard and stumble upon a headstone bearing a name, a date, and nothing more, you might be looking at the legacy of this ancient custom. Imagine the weight of living with your own epitaph, forced to witness the world waiting for your end, the stone forever patient, forever cold. For in the end, the punishment of the stone tablet was a mirror held up to mortality, a reminder that some deaths come long before the grave, and that the cruelest exile is not from the world, but from the hope of forgiveness itself.